Hello friends, tonight let's talk about a piece of history that sounds a bit thrilling, but is actually quite poignant. Imagine, over 100 years ago in London, without advanced medical technology or widespread media information, what would it be like if a terrible disease suddenly appeared? One that not only took lives but also made the dead appear to come alive. Sounds like a modern zombie movie, doesn't it? But what we're talking about tonight isn't a fictional story. It's about the deep fear and the ways people in the Victorian era coped with the panic brought by real plagues. If you had lived back then and suddenly saw someone collapse on the street, only to stagger back up, that feeling would probably be more terrifying than walking alone at night, wouldn't it? If you're interested in tonight's story, remember to give it a like and subscribe to our channel, so we can wander through the river of history together every night. Feel free to share in the comments where you are and what time it is for you. Find a comfortable position, close your eyes, let the surrounding light dim, and let's together slowly enter this historical journey of the mysterious and unknown Victorian London. London in the 19th century was one of the most prosperous cities in the world. The roar of steam engines echoed along the banks of the Thames. Towering factory chimneys pointed to the sky like giant fingers, and horse-drawn carriages weaved through crowded streets filled with bustling crowds. The British Empire was at its zenith, and wealth flowed into the city like a tide, but it also brought unprecedented challenges. The rapid population growth led to the spread of slums like shadows across the city. Dirty streets, overcrowded housing, and a lack of clean drinking water and sewage systems all provided fertile ground for the breeding and spread of diseases. In that era, people's understanding of diseases was very limited. The concepts of bacteria and viruses were not yet widely known, and the causes of many illnesses remained shrouded in mystery. The miasma theory, which held that diseases were spread by foul air, largely influenced people's perceptions. Therefore, when a plague arrived, people often felt helpless, groping in the dark for vague explanations and methods of coping. During the Victorian era, London suffered from various diseases. Cholera, a virulent infectious disease spread through contaminated water, erupted in large-scale outbreaks multiple times, claiming countless lives. Patients experienced severe vomiting and diarrhea, leading to rapid dehydration, gaunt faces, and cold skin, making them appear lifeless to onlookers. Typhoid fever, tuberculosis, and smallpox also lingered like persistent ghosts, constantly threatening people's health. Each epidemic triggered a wave of panic in the city. People feared infection and the arrival of death. Imagine you're living in London at that time. You wake up in the morning, and the air is filled with the smell of coal smoke and various unpleasant odors. You quickly eat a simple breakfast, and then rush to the factory or shop to start your day's work. The streets are crowded with people of all sorts, their faces tired, their clothes ragged. Suddenly you see a commotion in the crowd ahead. Someone has collapsed on the ground, convulsing and foaming at the mouth. The people around scream in terror, scattering as if they've seen some dreadful monster. Such scenes were not uncommon in London at the time. Various diseases could break out at any moment, and each outbreak would bring a huge psychological impact. Death hung over people's heads like the sword of Damocles, ready to fall at any time. People not only had to face the threat of the disease itself but also the fear and anxiety it brought. In the absence of scientific explanations, people often attributed plagues to supernatural causes. Some believed it was divine punishment, a warning against human sins. They would organize religious ceremonies, confess, and pray, hoping to receive divine forgiveness and thus stop the spread of the plague. Churches were packed with people praying, their expressions solemn, their eyes filled with fear and anticipation. Others believed that evil forces were at work. They would seek out so-called witches or evil spirits, believing that these dark entities brought disease and death. In some extreme cases, violent acts against these scapegoats even occurred, as people tried to appease the plague by eliminating what they perceived as the culprits. This blind panic and superstition not only failed to solve the problem but also exacerbated social unrest. Of course, some people tried to explain the occurrence of plagues from a rational perspective. With the development of medicine, some doctors began to observe and record cases, trying to find patterns in disease transmission. Dr. John Snow, through his meticulous investigation of cholera outbreaks, eventually discovered that contaminated water was the main cause of disease spread, which was a groundbreaking discovery at the time. However, this scientific understanding was largely confined to a few intellectuals and doctors, and ordinary people found it difficult to accept the theory of invisible germs. During epidemics, governments and local agencies would also take some countermeasures. Quarantine was one of the most common methods. Once an infected person was discovered, authorities would often act quickly to forcibly send the patient to a dedicated quarantine area or hospital, or directly quarantine the entire family at home. Doors and windows of houses would be boarded up, and prominent signs would be posted outside, warning passers-by to stay away. For quarantined families, this was undoubtedly a huge blow. They not only had to face the torment of the disease but also the loneliness of isolation from the outside world and the despair of possibly losing their livelihood. On the streets, one could occasionally see horse-drawn carriages transporting patients, the drivers wearing heavy masks, and painful groans emanating from the carriages. This silent scene was enough to make every witness's heart sink. In addition, some charitable organizations and church groups would actively participate in relief efforts. They would provide food, medicine, and temporary shelter for impoverished patients, and organize personnel to carry out sanitation work, attempting to improve the city's environmental hygiene. These acts of kindness alleviated the suffering caused by the plague to some extent and demonstrated the brilliance of humanity in society. However, in the face of large-scale epidemics, these efforts often seemed like drops in the bucket. The speed of disease transmission far exceeded people's ability to respond, and the death toll continued to rise, casting a pall of oppression and despair over the entire city. People became numb, feeling lost about the future. Horse-drawn carriages carrying corpses were everywhere on the streets, and the air was filled with the smell of disinfectant and death. In such an environment, it was not surprising that some conjectures about living dead began to circulate among the populace. When people saw those who died from illness with distorted faces and stiff bodies, or those patients who were confused and behaved abnormally in the later stages of the disease, it was easy to associate them with the legendary living dead. The pain and death brought by the disease were distorted and amplified in people's imaginations, ultimately evolving into an extreme fear of the unknown and death. This fear, like an invisible virus, spread rapidly among the population, exacerbating social panic and chaos. People became suspicious, distrustful of each other, and mutual trust was weakened. Rumors and alarming reports spread everywhere, further intensifying social unrest. Against this backdrop, Victorian London truly seemed to become a city filled with zombie-like fear. In Victorian London, as the shadow of the plague enveloped the city, people lacking modern scientific knowledge, facing patients with bizarre symptoms and terrifying deaths, naturally developed various conjectures and panics deep within their hearts. These conjectures often carried strong folk and supernatural tendencies, personifying the disease and even linking it to legends of the living dead, thereby amplifying the panic invisibly, as if a zombie virus were truly spreading. People at that time had a far less clear understanding of diseases than we do now. They didn't know that tiny bacteria were at work, nor how viruses spread silently through the population. All they could see were those tormented by illness, their bodies rapidly weakening, faces turning pale, eyes glazed, sometimes even exhibiting convulsions and stiffness. And those who unfortunately passed away, without proper handling, had distorted faces and stiff bodies, and might even assume eerie postures due to post-mortem muscle contraction. These sights, filtered through superstition and fear, were easily interpreted as signs of resurrection. Many stories about the living dead circulated among the populace. These stories were not baseless. They often stemmed from people's fear of death and their attempts to explain unknown phenomena. For example, some people believed that those who died from the plague had not truly left their bodies, but were instead bound by some evil force, becoming beings between life and death. They might wander at night, seeking the flesh and blood of the living, or spreading the disease to more people. This belief undoubtedly intensified people's fear of the dead, even leading to extreme acts of desecration of corpses in some places to prevent their resurrection. Others regarded the plague as a curse, or punishment. They believed that humanity's sins had angered the deities, thus bringing down this terrible disease. Consequently, during epidemics, religious activities were exceptionally frequent. People flocked to churches, confessing to God with tears streaming down their faces, begging for divine protection. Priests, in their sermons, repeatedly emphasized the connection between sin and disease, further reinforcing people's mystified perception of the plague. They believed that only through devout prayer and repentance could the plague be appeased and they themselves avoid becoming the next living dead. Besides religion and superstition, people also personified diseases. They called cholera the Blue Death, because patients' skin would turn blue from lack of oxygen. Tuberculosis was called the White Plague, because it silently claimed lives, leaving patients pale. These vivid appellations, while partly reflecting the symptoms of the diseases, also imbued them with a terrifying vitality, making people feel as if they were conscious monsters, roaming the city, ready to pounce at any moment. On those nights filled with panic, people would tightly close their doors and windows, light candles, and pray that they and their families would get through safely. They would tell each other terrifying stories about the living dead, and while these stories made them more afraid, they also seemed to provide a way to vent their fear. In such an atmosphere, any slight disturbance, any unusual sound, could be infinitely magnified, triggering a new wave of panic. Some doctors and scholars, though beginning to try to understand diseases in a more scientific way, their voices seemed insignificant in the face of immense panic. The mainstream medical community at the time was still bound by traditional theories, lacking effective means for disease transmission and treatment. They would try various treatments, such as bloodletting, herbal remedies, or using seemingly purifying spices, but these methods were often ineffective, or even counterproductive. Against this backdrop, people's trust in doctors also began to waver. When doctors couldn't cure diseases, or even became infected themselves, people felt even more desperate and helpless. Quacks and charlatans took advantage of the situation, peddling various so-called miracle cures and secret formulas, claiming they could cure all diseases and even prevent the plague. These miracle cures often had no effect whatsoever and might even contain toxic substances, further exacerbating patients' suffering and death. In some slums, the situation was particularly dire. People there lived in extremely poor conditions, malnourished and with low resistance, making them more susceptible to disease. When the plague struck, they were often the first victims and the most severely affected. Due to a lack of medical resources and quarantine facilities, the disease spread rapidly in the slums, leading to a large number of deaths. The deceased bodies sometimes were not even properly handled, piling up in the streets and alleys, further exacerbating the spread of disease and public panic. This conjecture of living dead, also reflected society's fear and exclusion of marginalized groups at the time. When the plague broke out, some people would blame the poor, vulnerable, or foreign populations for the disease, believing them to be the source of the illness and scourges of society. This discrimination and prejudice caused those who unfortunately contracted the disease to suffer not only physical pain, but also mental torment. They might be abandoned by family and friends, ostracized by society, and ultimately die in loneliness and despair. However, amidst all the panic and superstition, there was still a glimmer of rationality. Some insightful individuals began to call on the government to take more effective measures, improve urban sanitation, and provide clean drinking water. They believed that only by fundamentally solving the problem could the spread of the plague truly be controlled. These calls, though not sufficiently heeded at the time, laid the foundation for later public health reforms. Scholars, when studying Victorian-era plagues, often refer to the psychological state of people at that time. They found that in the face of great uncertainty and the threat of death, the human psyche becomes exceptionally fragile and sensitive. People would seek all sorts of explanations, whether scientific or supernatural, to try to understand and control this uncontrollable force. The living dead conjecture was an extreme manifestation of this psychological state. It reflected people's deepest fear of death, their imagination of the unknown world, and their desperate desire to find some explanation. This panic also prompted people to reflect on societal problems. They began to realize that issues such as wealth disparity, environmental pollution, and a lack of public health facilities were closely linked to the outbreak of plagues. The plague, like a mirror, reflected the various ills present in Victorian society. It forced people to consider how to build a healthier, more equitable society. On those nights filled with zombie virus-like fear, people might hold their loved ones tightly, praying for the dawn. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring, nor if they would be spared. But they still struggled to survive, seeking hope amidst the fear. This resilient spirit also became a unique way for Victorians to cope with the plague. When the shadow of the plague truly enveloped Victorian London, the panic was no longer merely psychological. It began to manifest in various concrete and chaotic scenes spreading throughout the city. The government and various sectors of society, though striving to respond, often appeared clumsy and ineffective in their measures by modern standards, sometimes even exacerbating public fear. In the early stages of the outbreak, the most common response was quarantine. Once a family had an infected member, authorities would usually act quickly, forcibly sending the patient to a quarantine hospital, or directly isolating the entire family at home. Doors and windows of houses would be boarded up, and conspicuous signs would be posted outside, warning passers-by to keep away. For quarantine families, this was undoubtedly a huge blow. They not only had to face the torment of the disease but also the loneliness of isolation from the outside world and the despair of potentially losing their livelihood. On the streets, one could occasionally see horse-drawn carriages transporting patients, the drivers wearing heavy masks, and painful groans emanating from the carriages. This silent scene was enough to make every witness's heart sink. The power of religion became particularly prominent at this time. When science could not provide answers and medicine could not cure pain, people naturally turned to faith. Churches were packed with people praying, kneeling on cold stone slabs, tearfully confessing to God, and begging for divine protection. Priests, in their sermons, repeatedly emphasized that the plague was God's punishment, retribution for human sins, and that only through devout repentance and prayer could salvation be achieved. While this narrative maintained social order to some extent, it also intensified people's inner guilt and fear. Religious processions also occurred from time to time, with people holding crosses and singing hymns, slowly marching through the streets, attempting to dispel the shadow of the plague through this collective ritual. However, in the face of panic, the complexity of human nature was also exposed. Some wealthy families would choose to quickly flee London, seeking refuge in the countryside or other cities. They traveled by carriage, carrying their luggage, hastily leaving the plague-ridden city. While this behavior can be understood as self-preservation, it also exacerbated social division. The poor who could not escape were left in the city, facing the threat of disease and the despair of being abandoned. At the same time, there were also instances of opportunism in society. Some unscrupulous individuals would impersonate doctors or pharmacists, peddling various so-called miracle cures and secret formulas, claiming to cure all diseases and even prevent the plague. These miracle cures were often useless placebos, and some might even contain harmful substances, but people in panic, desperate for a cure, would spare no expense to buy these false hopes. Others would take the opportunity to inflate prices and hoard daily necessities, making life even harder for ordinary people. Now, imagine you are an ordinary citizen in Victorian London. In the morning, you are awakened by a hurried knock at the door. It's your next-door neighbor, her face pale, her eyes filled with terror. She tells you that her child started a fever last night and developed severe vomiting and diarrhea. Your heart sinks. You are all too familiar with the symptoms of cholera. You look at her helpless eyes, wanting to say something comforting, but your throat is so dry you can't make a sound. You quickly get dressed and step out of your home. On the street, the usual bustling scene has disappeared. Shops are closed, street performers are nowhere to be seen, and there are only a few scattered figures, wearing crude masks, hurrying by. The air is filled with the pungent smell of lime powder, which the government has scattered for disinfection. You see a black carriage parked in front of your neighbor's house a short distance away, and several people in protective suits are lifting something into it. You know in your heart that it's your neighbor's child. They've been taken away. You feel a wave of dizziness, your stomach churning. You're afraid that you or your family will be the next to be taken. You start to wonder if you drank unclean water yesterday, or if you accidentally touched something unclean on the street. Your mind flashes with all sorts of terrifying rumors about the plague, the stories of the living dead, the descriptions of how the disease disfigures people, all of which send shivers down your spine. You decide to go to church. Perhaps it can bring you some comfort. When you enter the church, you find it already packed with people. They are kneeling on the ground, praying in low voices, and the air is filled with the scent of candles and incense. You find an empty spot, kneel down, and clasp your hands. You don't know what to say, but you silently pray in your heart, begging God to protect you and your family, and to end this terrible plague soon. However, even in church, it's hard to completely shake off your inner fear. You hear someone next to you coughing softly, and you immediately move away cautiously. You see someone with a pale face, and you wonder, are they infected too? This feeling of suspicion makes you incredibly tired. You find yourself subconsciously avoiding contact with others, and even when talking to family members, you deliberately keep your distance. In the evening, you return home and tightly close the doors and windows. You wipe the furniture with a damp cloth, trying to remove the invisible miasma. You light all the candles, filling the room with light, as if that could dispel the fear in the darkness. You sit by the fireplace, listening to the occasional sound of carriages and coughs from outside, each sound making your heart pound. You start to suffer from insomnia. Every night, you are woken by nightmares, dreaming of being afflicted by the plague, dreaming of your loved ones falling one by one. You find that there are more and more reports about the plague in the newspapers. The death toll continues to rise, and the government's response seems to be having little effect. You feel a deep sense of despair. You don't know when this plague will end, nor if you will live to see that day. You start to think, what if you really get infected? Will you also become one of those hideous, living dead? This thought sends shivers down your spine. You see some neighbors starting to hang various amulets at their doorsteps or smear strange symbols on their windows. They believe these things can ward off evil and protect them from the plague. Although you know in your heart that these might not be useful, you can't help but buy some and hang them at your own doorstep. In the face of panic, people often grasp at any glimmer of hope, no matter how illusory. You start to become cautious. Every time you go out, you wear a thick scarf to cover your mouth and nose. You avoid crowded places and contact with strangers. You even start to suspect those you once trusted, because you don't know who will be the next infected person. This sense of distrust makes the entire society extremely tense and fragile. You also see families who have lost all their loved ones due to the plague. Those who survived have gaunt faces and empty eyes, as if their souls have been sucked out. Their grief infects the entire city, making people more deeply feel the immense pain caused by the plague. You silently pray in your heart, hoping that such a tragedy will not happen to you. In such an atmosphere of panic, people's daily lives were completely disrupted. Schools closed, shops shut down, and factories ceased operation. The entire city seemed to fall into a state of stagnation. People dared not go out, dared not work, and could only stay at home, waiting for the plague to end. This long wait made people feel exceptionally tormented. However, even in the darkest moments, there was still a glimmer of human kindness. You saw some doctors who, despite personal danger, went deep into the epidemic areas to provide treatment for patients. You saw some philanthropists who generously donated funds to establish temporary hospitals, buy medicines and food, and help the impoverished patients. You also saw ordinary people helping and encouraging each other, overcoming difficulties together. These acts of kindness were like faint lights in the darkness, bringing a ray of hope to people. In Victorian London, the panic caused by the plague was not just a physical illness but also a spiritual torment. It showed people the cruelty of death and the complexity of human nature. It forced people to re-examine life, faith, and society. And the conjectures about the living dead, although products of superstition, also reflected people's most primitive fears deep within their hearts when facing the unknown and death. In Victorian London, as the shadow of the plague enveloped the city and panic and despair spread like a tide, even in the darkest hours, the light of humanity never completely extinguished. There were always some individuals who, with courage, wisdom, and care for others, ignited faint sparks of hope amidst the despair. These efforts not only alleviated suffering at the time but also left valuable lessons for future generations, guiding humanity in facing unknown diseases. First, we must mention those brave doctors. At that time, medical knowledge was very limited, and doctors' understanding of diseases was far less than it is today. They had no antibiotics, no vaccines, and even basic concepts of disinfection were not yet widespread. However, in the face of the raging plague, many doctors chose not to flee but selflessly devoted themselves to treating the sick. They ventured deep into epidemic areas, risking immense personal danger of infection, to provide patients with what care they could. They would carefully observe patients' symptoms, record the progression of the disease, and try to find clues for treatment. Among them, Dr. John Snow was undoubtedly the brightest star in this darkness. He did not see bacteria through a microscope, but through rigorous logical reasoning and meticulous on-site investigation, he ultimately revealed the truth that cholera was spread through contaminated water. He drew detailed maps, marking the location of each cholera case, and found that these cases were concentrated around a particular water pump. When he successfully persuaded the authorities to remove the handle of that water pump, the spread of cholera was indeed effectively controlled. This story, though not fully understood by everyone at the time, was undoubtedly an important milestone in humanity's scientific triumph over superstition and ignorance. It tells us that even when facing terrifying diseases that seem like living dead, as long as we persist in scientific inquiry, the truth can always be found. Besides doctors, many philanthropists and ordinary citizens also demonstrated the kindness and mutual aid of humanity through their actions. Some wealthy philanthropists generously donated funds to establish temporary hospitals, purchase medicines and food, and provide assistance to impoverished patients. They organized volunteers to go deep into the slums, bringing warmth and care to those abandoned by society. These acts of kindness were like a beam of light in the darkness, illuminating helpless souls. Ordinary people also showed touching spirit of mutual aid. When a neighbor fell ill, despite the fear in their hearts, many still chose to lend a hand. They would bring food to sick neighbors, help them care for their children, or provide some nursing care within their means. In an era where quarantine measures were prevalent, this mutual aid was particularly precious. It tells us that even in the most desperate moments, human compassion and community spirit never disappeared. Churches and religious groups also played an important role during the plague. Although some of their beliefs might have been superstitious, the spiritual comfort and practical help they provided were crucial in stabilizing social emotions and alleviating public panic. They organized prayer meetings, held funerals for the dead, and provided psychological support for the living. Many nuns and priests, disregarding their personal safety, went deep into epidemic areas to care for the sick and provide hospice care. Their spirit of dedication made people feel the power of faith and despair. Under the impact of the plague, Victorian society also began to reflect. People started to realize that the city's terrible sanitation was a major reason for frequent plague outbreaks. The overcrowding of slums, the overflowing sewage, and the accumulation of garbage all became breeding grounds for diseases. This disaster forced the government and all sectors of society to start paying attention to public health issues. Consequently, a series of public health reforms began to be put on the agenda. The government started investing funds to build new sewage systems, improve water supply facilities, and clean up urban waste. Although the progress of these reforms was slow and difficult, they undoubtedly laid the foundation for public health in London and even throughout Britain. These efforts made the city cleaner and significantly improved people's living environment. At the same time, the plague also promoted the development of medical science. John Snow's cholera research laid the foundation for the birth of epidemiology as a discipline. His research method, which involved observing and analyzing disease patterns to find the causes, provided important lessons for later medical research. Over time, germ theory was gradually accepted, and people's understanding of diseases became clearer. These scientific advancements enabled humanity, when facing diseases, to no longer be as helpless as in the past, but to have more effective weapons. The zombie virus of the Victorian era, those terrifying plagues, though bringing immense suffering and death, also became a significant turning point in human history. It forced people to confront their societal problems, stimulated the spirit of scientific exploration, and demonstrated the brilliance of humanity and the power of mutual aid. In a sense, it was precisely these past panics and struggles that propelled the progress of human civilization, allowing us to better understand and cope with diseases. Looking back at that history, we might feel a touch of gratitude, grateful that we live in an era with advanced medical technology and public health systems. But at the same time, that history also reminds us that even in today's technologically advanced world, we still need to maintain reverence for nature, respect for science, and cherish humanity. Because, no matter how times change, courage, wisdom, and mutual aid will always be the powerful forces that help humanity overcome all difficulties. Alright, friends, that's all for tonight's story. The shadows of the plague that once loomed over Victorian London, and the panic about living dead, have all gradually faded with the passage of time. But the faint lights that flickered in the darkness, and the brilliance of human nature, will forever remain in the river of history. It's late, and the city's clamor has subsided. May tonight's story accompany you into a peaceful and tranquil dream. Let those historical scenes gently flow through your mind, finally transforming into a serene starry sky. Good night, and sweet dreams.